Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. We love to dig into some really fascinating topics on this show, and today we're going to be doing a deep dive into learning styles, specifically how knowing whether you're a visual learner, auditory, kinesthetic, whatever it might be,
Hmm.
how that can actually unlock a lot more learning power for you.
What's really fascinating about learning styles is that it's not like a one-size-fits-all approach.
Hmm.
Each of us, we have different strengths, different preferences when it comes to how we best absorb information, how we best retain information.
Yeah, okay, so let's set the scene here. Think about it. You've all been in a classroom setting, right, where some students, they just seem to effortlessly grasp concepts from charts and diagrams and things like
Yeah.
that. Well, other students are just completely lost looking at those. But then maybe the teacher starts to lecture and suddenly those students who are lost with the charts, they just light up.
Yeah, that is a perfect illustration of how auditory learners operate. They thrive on spoken words. They thrive on sounds. I mean, think about it, the rhythm of a lecture, the intonation of a voice, the nuances of a discussion. All of these things are really rich in information that just resonates deeply with their brains.
So it's not just about hearing the words, it's about how those words are delivered, the whole soundscape of it all.
Exactly. And, when you think about the science of it, their brains, they're literally wired to process information through sound waves. And they're able to convert those sound waves into meaningful data.
It's so interesting to think about, okay, so I'm already thinking, I'm putting myself in the seat of the listener, and they're thinking, okay, lectures are great, but how can I use this in my everyday life? How can I, as an auditory learner, even outside of a formal lecture setting, what are some strategies?
So this is where we go beyond just passive listening and we step into the realm of active learning strategies. So one technique that is incredibly effective for auditory learners are mnemonic devices. So think rhymes, jingles, other memory aids that can help turn information into catchy little sound bites. I mean, remember back in the day when we were all trying to memorize the periodic table of elements, putting those elements to music, that's a classic example of a mnemonic device for auditory learners.
Oh, totally. It makes so much sense because when I think about how easily a song can get stuck in my head, I realize how powerful that connection between sound and memory is.
Absolutely. It's all about harnessing that power of music and rhythm, encode that information in a way that's memorable and engaging. Another strategy that can be super helpful for auditory learners is recording and listening back to key information.
I was just going to say that, so are we talking about recording every lecture or meeting? Because that seems a little overwhelming.
Yeah. Well, recording can definitely be valuable, but I think it's really important to use it strategically. Focus on capturing those really important points. Don't feel like you need to record every single word. Think of it as kind of creating a personalized audio library of key concepts.
And I would imagine this goes hand in hand with just active listening in general. So really paying attention, asking questions, summarizing key points, even talking through those points out loud to yourself. It's not just about hearing, it's about engaging with it.
100% active engagement is key for any learning style. But it is especially crucial for those auditory learners. And when they participate actively in the learning process, they're really strengthening those neural pathways and making that information stick.
Okay, this is starting to make me rethink how I take notes. Okay, now let's kind of switch gears for a second and talk about a different kind of learning experience. Remember that feeling of triumph after you've successfully assembled a piece of IKEA furniture using only those diagrams?
Oh, that's a perfect example of the visual learner's strength. They are incredible at processing information that is presented visually. And it's not just about, simple pictures. We're talking about charts, diagrams, mind maps, timelines, videos. All of these things are visual tools that can really help them create mental pictures. And this can make those complex ideas so much easier to grasp.
It does seem like sometimes visual learning gets categorized as the most traditional style, maybe even a little less exciting than the others.
That's a common misconception. Visual learning is actually incredibly dynamic and engaging, especially when you consider how visual learners think. They often have this knack for spatial reasoning. They can see patterns and connections that others just completely miss. It's like they're visualizing information in 3D. They can rotate it. They can dissect it. And they're able to understand it from so many different angles.
Like they have a built-in CAD program in their brain.
Right.
Okay, so let's say someone isn't naturally a visual learner. Can they actually train themselves to become better at it?
Absolutely. Visual learning skills can be developed and strengthened over time. Just think about some simple strategies like color coding your notes, Using different colors to highlight those key points, maybe to categorize information.
Almost creating like a visual hierarchy of the information.
Exactly. Or using mind maps to connect those ideas, visually drawing diagrams to break down complex processes. Even something as simple as sketching little things in the margins of your notes can really activate those visual pathways. And it helps you make connections that you might have otherwise missed.
Okay, so we've talked about auditory learners, we talked about visual learners, but now I want to dive into the world of kinesthetic learners. It's interesting because there's often this stereotype of a kinesthetic learner being that fidgety student who can't sit still.
Yeah, that stereotype, it's definitely played for laughs sometimes, but it actually holds a kernel of truth. Kinesthetic learners, they're all about action and experience. They're the doers, they're the movers, they're the tinkerers. So sitting still for long periods, that's just not really their forte.
So instead of fighting that urge to move, how can we channel that energy into productive learning?
It really comes down to turning abstract concepts into tangible experiences. For kinesthetic learners, knowledge is something you do, not just something you hear or see.
Okay, so how does that translate into like actual learning strategies? I can imagine it's pretty straightforward for hands-on subjects like science experiments or building projects. But what about things like history or literature that might seem less obviously hands-on?
You just got to get creative and think outside that traditional textbook. Let's take history, for example. Instead of just reading about a historical event, why not have students role play it? They can step into the shoes of historical figures. They can debate those key decisions, and they can experience firsthand the complexities of those events.
That's such a cool way to bring history to life.
Yeah.
And I bet it makes those events much more memorable than just reading about them in a textbook.
Exactly. And when it comes to literature, think about creating a diorama of like a key scene from a novel, or even building a model of a character's house. By physically interacting with the setting and the characters, kinesthetic learners can really deepen their understanding of the story. And even more importantly, the themes.
It's about turning those stories into something they can touch and feel.
Precisely. And even when you're thinking about like learning a new language in corporate movement, use gestures to reinforce vocabulary. Create a little stage where they can act out simple dialogues.
Okay, that's a great example. So for anyone working with a kinesthetic learner, what would you say is like the biggest takeaway?
Embrace that need to move. Design learning experiences that allow them to interact with the material physically. Even simple things like using a whiteboard to work out problems, or just taking frequent breaks to stretch and move around can make a world of difference.
What about all those fidget toys that have become so popular? Are those actually helpful for learning, or are they more of a distraction?
There's actually been research suggesting that using something like a stress ball or a fidget toy during study sessions, it can actually help some kinesthetic learners focus and retain information. I know it might seem a little counterintuitive, but for some people, that extrasensory input really helps them stay engaged. It helps prevent their minds from wandering.
It's like their brains need that tactile stimulation to really stay on track.
Exactly. Now, of course, it's important to make sure that the fidgeting is purposeful.
Yeah.
We don't want it to become a distraction for themselves or others. But for some kinesthetic learners, a well-chosen fidget toy can really be a valuable tool in their learning arsenal.
So we've explored these three very distinct learning styles: auditory, visual, and kinesthetic. But I have a feeling that a lot of our listeners out there are realizing they don't fit neatly into just one box.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We rarely exist as purely one type of learner. Most of us are what's called multimodal learners, meaning we incorporate elements from all three styles to varying degrees.
So it's more like a spectrum than like three distinct categories.
Precisely. And that's the beauty of understanding learning styles, is that it empowers us to create these really personalized learning experiences that cater to our unique strengths and preferences.
So how do we go about figuring out our own personal learning style blend?
It all starts with self-awareness. Pay attention to how you naturally gravitate towards learning. What activities energize you, what strategies help you really focus and retain that information. Think back to your own experiences, in the classroom, at work, even in your hobbies. What methods have worked best for you in the past?
I'm also wondering if like our learning style preferences can kind of change based on the situation or the subject matter.
Yeah.
For example, I find that I lean more heavily on visual aids when I'm trying to grasp a complex concept. But then I might switch to a more auditory approach when I'm like learning a new language.
That's such a great observation. Our learning style preferences can definitely be fluid, and they adapt to different contexts and different challenges. That's why it's so important to be flexible and willing to experiment with different approaches.
It's almost like having this toolbox filled with all these different learning strategies, and we can choose the right tool for the job.
Exactly. The key is to really become a student of your own learning process. Observe what works, observe what doesn't, and just be open to trying new things.
This deep dive has been so insightful. I feel like I've gained a whole new understanding of not just how I learn, but how others learn as well.
And that's the power of understanding learning styles. It can transform how we approach education training, even personal development.
It's almost like learning styles are kind of this secret code to unlocking better communication and understanding in general.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, imagine a workplace where managers understand the learning styles of their team members, and they tailor their training programs, their communication strategies to those styles. Or think about classrooms where teachers are presenting information in a variety of ways to cater to those different learning preferences. It can really create a more inclusive and effective learning environment for everybody.
And it's not just limited to like those formal learning environments. Think about how this knowledge can improve our personal relationships. If you know that your partner is a visual learner, maybe you start leaving them little notes or create like a shared visual calendar to keep track of things.
Yeah, it's all about speaking each other's learning language. And it can make a world of difference in how we connect with one another.
I'm kind of curious, are there any potential downsides to focusing too much on learning styles? Could it almost become limiting in any way?
That's a really great question. And I think it's important to acknowledge that learning styles aren't the be-all and end-all of learning. We don't want to box people in by a certain label. The real power is using this knowledge as a starting point for exploration and experimentation.
So it's not about saying, okay, I'm a visual learner, therefore I can only learn through visual means. It's more about saying, okay, I know visual aids tend to work really well for me, so I'm going to prioritize those. But I'm also going to be open to trying other approaches that might surprise me.
Exactly. It's about expanding our learning repertoire, not limiting it. And, it's also important to remember that learning styles are just one piece of the puzzle. There are other factors at play, like motivation, mindset, prior knowledge. All of those things play a really significant role in how we learn.
It's just a good reminder that learning is this dynamic and multifaceted process.
And that's what makes it so fascinating. We're constantly evolving and adapting as learners. And the more we understand about how we learn best, the more we can optimize those learning experiences.
I love that perspective. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of learning styles, what's the one key takeaway you hope our listeners walk away with?
I really hope they feel empowered to become active participants in their own learning journeys. Embrace your unique learning style, but don't be afraid to step outside that comfort zone and try new things.
Become the CEO of your own learning process.
Exactly. Experiment, reflect, adjust. And most importantly, enjoy the process of lifelong learning.
That's the perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into learning styles.
It's been my pleasure.
And for our listeners out there, if you're feeling inspired to explore your own learning style further, we'll be sharing some resources and some links on our social media channels.
We'd also love to hear your thoughts and your insights. Share your experiences, your favorite learning strategies, anything that sparked your curiosity during this episode.
Until next time, keep diving deep and keep learning.